Today we are going to discuss a subject which is very vast. The subject is democracy and pluralism, a historical perspective. This is a very vast subject, both democracy and pluralism, and it can be seen very differently in different disciplines. I am a student of history and I would like to discuss some of the things which, as a student of history, I see as important for students in general. Democracy is an idea in which people are important. The system, political system as such, has given importance to the idea of democracy where all citizens are given importance. But I would like to begin with the notion of idea of equality or dignity to individuals in our tradition. You must have heard about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. I mean, we all are together, we all are important. But in modern times, in India, this democracy, the idea of democracy as we understand today, is basically coming from enlightenment of Europe. In different parts of the globe, this idea of enlightenment has affected. The modernity has arrived with an European bias, and in India also we find that democracy, the idea of democracy, is entering into the minds of our enlightened people who had been educated in the Western education system. Some of them had studied in England, and the idea of democracy must have entered into their mind during that time. In general, if I may be allowed to say, I would like to say that democracy got instilled into the minds of Indian political leaders and intellectuals in the first half of 20th century. And we can realize that if we read Sabyasachi Bhattacharya's book, Talking Back, wonderful book, in which he had said that Indians had started talking back and Indian people started to negotiate with the modern ideas of the West. And there we find that Indians had been negotiating with different modern ideas as Indians with a different understanding of culture, tradition, history, political idea, and so on and so forth. But if we see carefully, even before that, before 1900, we find that Indian people were thinking about the rights of individuals, and in various ways we were moving towards the idea of democracy. In 1920s, more particularly in 30s and in 40s, it was very clear that Indian national movement leaders and the then intellectuals of India and the great minds who may be operational in the field of literature, philosophy, or any other field, they all had been in agreement on one point, that India needed democracy. Their notions were different. Some of them visualized the coming of democracy in their own way, but overall we may say that democracy was the agreed upon idea. It was in consensus, people, leaders were in consensus with the idea of democracy. But that idea of democracy, given importance to people, can be seen differently in the realm of history, in the realm of other disciplines, and in the realm of creative writings. India was being discovered by enlightened minds. India was interpreted differently, but one thing was sure, that Indians had had something in them which could be seen moving towards or welcoming towards the idea of democracy. This is how I put it. So India was Indians' demand. Democracy was Indians' demand, I would say. The credit for this should not be given to one person or a group of people. Whole India was moving towards a system in which democracy would be the ideal one. So once India got independence, Indians needed democracy, or India needs democracy, was the voice of the powerful political leaders. How this should be the guiding principle was debated upon, but overall agreement was that India needed a democracy. Jawaharlal Nehru, Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, Rajgopalachari, Sardar Patel, and Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, all leaders wanted India to take the democracy, the path of democracy. Now, this can be understood very clearly that Indian leaders wanted a system in which democratic ideals were respected. If we see the debates of Constituent Assembly, we see that all of them were very respectful towards the idea of democracy. There were debates, there were the issues in which the people from one section wanted certain kind of rights, but overall we should be seen as equal. That was the main thing. But this is enlightened leaders' perspective. But at the ground level, we must admit that the society was not prepared for democracy. Why society was not prepared is something about which we can refer to historical conditions. We all know that Indians lived in a system where the ruling authorities were not very interfering before the Britishers came. They allowed the people to live in their own way, continuing with their own traditions. Therefore, people were not very conscious of, or they were not very concerned about how they are being governed. So the politics or the governance was not their concern. But now, when the modern system got introduced and India opted for parliamentary system where elections were becoming important, voting becomes important. At this point of time, people had to be aware of the consequences of their exercising the voting rights. but the people were not prepared. So first point which I would like to highlight is that India was getting a democratic system. Indian system was democratic, but the people were not very prepared for it. And therefore, we have a problem, and that problem persisted. The second point, which I should have mentioned by now, is that those people who thought about democracy thought about equal rights of people, a citizen. They found that India is a vast country. India is a country where large number of practices, large number of languages, and different kind of things were there. India is not a very small country or a homogeneous country. India had a very different kind of composition. It was not like European nation state. How to deal with that? And this was a problem which was talked about in 30s and 40s also. But when India got independence, there were issues on which the leadership had debated. And finally, it was found that there were groups which could not have been in a position to compete with their fellow citizens if they are not given special preferences or special facilities by the government. All these were acknowledged by the government, and various policies were framed for that. So India is moving towards democracy, and the election process is going to be very important in the political process. This created a kind of predicament. Indian Constitution was democratic. It ensured the rights of every individual in India, and it was very much a democratic constitution. There cannot be any doubt that those people who framed the constitution were in favor of democracy, and they were consciously trying to introduce a system in India which was democratic. They picked good points from different constitutions of the world, and we have a constitution which was truly democratic, and the leadership and the framers of constitution should be credited for that. But the real predicament which I must emphasize again here is that once the political process was entering into the electoral phase, the people's aspirations, people's expectations, and various opportunities to political parties to maneuver or use or misuse the space where they could influence their constituencies with various issues could be a problem. And that is because, in India, peasants have different demands, workers had different demands, and various communities had some issues which needed to be addressed. But once election process starts and the various communities and caste groups, all they were getting influenced by a political contestations, different claims of different parties, different agenda of different parties. All these actually gave some bit of problem. It created some problem for the political leadership. And the various divisive elements, I would say, became very pronounced in the political process. Votes were mobilized in the name of caste, region, language, and various other kind of issues. And in that process, what happens? People's demands were interpreted differently by different political groups. And in that process, I would like to submit that some real and very difficult problems arose. How to deal with that? And in this context, the familiar us and dangerous outsiders became categories around which politics started. People started thinking about their own regional interest, and in that process, the factor of plurality was not given due importance. Somebody who is living in a region who is belonging to a majority group may be convinced by the fact that they have more rights than those who are coming from outside. So in the political process, the majority groups had a different set of demands or different kind of interpretations of how things should be done. Constitution was ensuring everybody that you can go to any part of the country and work and get equal treatment and equal opportunity. But in all practicalities, you can understand that the regional bias came in, and regional voices, not without any justification, they had their own reasons to follow that particular political line. But overall, we see that this plurality becomes a problem for government. How to deal with that? And in this connection, we find various difficulties and some issues which could not be resolved in the political process. India needed various kinds of propaganda, I would say. India needed education of that kind in which people could understand that democracy is very important, or equality before law is not something which is to be read in the textbook. It has to be practiced. One should realize that somebody who is lagging behind needs to be given reservation, needs to be given extra protection, needs to be given reservation or some bit of support, which may be seen as unjust to others, but if you take the whole picture, you would find that for the development of democracy, that was needed. All these can be found in the literature of the time. You will find in various Indian language novels and other kind of writings that the people were raising issues. They were talking about the inequalities. They were looking for opportunities for people who are economically vulnerable. But the system could not produce the results people wanted. So these kind of things actually led to a situation where the influential people became the custodians of or the most important people who actually control the system. And this continued for decades, and no government was able to understand that the problems of Indian society were different from the problems of a small state. You cannot frame laws and people would start following the next day, because Indian people were diverse with the very different kind of aspirations and problems. They were pressing for their pressing with their own demands and with very legitimate demands, and the solution was not available. So we find that in post-independence India, the regional factor becomes very important, and in that regional perspective, obviously, the son of the soil thought that our demand should be met before government should pay attention to those who have come from outside. So as I have said, familiar us and dangerous outsider, it persisted. And if that persists, then plurality becomes a problem. A plural society in India where there are so many religions, so many social groups, and various kinds of differences, diversities can be found in Indian society. So how to resolve that? So politics actually perpetuated these divides, and ultimately we find that India becomes almost politically unmanageable. And in 30-40 years time, we find various points where it looked like that the regions were not able to feel that the center is treating them well. This is a very complex scenario. Once you start thinking about regional or those regional powers perspective and people's aspirations, and think about the central government's attempts, we find that this is very problematic, and the riddle was not able to be solved. So what is to be done in that context? Government or education or the policy makers, educators, teachers, all have tried to give the message that Indians can be successful. They can be very, very successful only if we understand that our unity is non-negotiable. Our unity is important, and amidst all kind of diversities, India is one. It is to be very clearly seen that India was one, but the people at the ground level were facing so many problems that ultimately it could not be understood by the people who are economically and socially in a very deplorable conditions. So it was a very tricky situation. So now we move to the present scenario. I said that in the early 20th century, people started thinking in concrete terms about democracy and pluralism. In 30s and 40s, we find that we were in agreement that we needed democracy. We Indians need democracy, and diversity is not an issue. Rabindranath Tagore had very significantly and poignantly said that India is a society, India is a civilization where people from different sources come to India, and India is like an ocean where the different rivers come and get submerged. So India was an ocean where various rivers come and become Indians. So this diversity factor is not a problem in India. But in politically charged atmosphere, these kind of diversities became issues for politicians, and ultimately India was internally divided in a way which could not be avoided. So India needed a different kind of understanding which is to be trickled down, or which should be realized by people. And I had already said that democracy came to India in a tangible form through or by, it was brought by enlightened minds. But people were not ready for that. So it was a failure of independent India that people could not be made aware of the fact that this plurality is something which we can be very proud of. So many flowers are there in our Indian garden, should be realized by the people. But political process did not allow that to happen. So India comes to a point where these differences got crystallized politically. So various caste groups had their own preferred political parties, and we find that ultimately India is facing a problem of last, if you look back to last 10-15 years time, we find a different kind of ideological contest going on, in which the idea of democracy is articulated somewhat differently. And in this context, as a student of history, we can be very careful, we can be very watchful, and we should be very much aware of the fact that India needs an inclusive approach. It must try to understand that it cannot allow all groups to assert themselves in such a way that the Indian unity can be in danger. This is something which we all should realize, and therefore, if I have to sum up my discussion with you, I would say that democracy we all want. We all want our rights. We all want our problems to be solved. But we should be aware that for a democracy, for national unity, we must think not in us and them perspective. We must think like Indians. Sometimes, as privileged groups, we have a responsibility to think about who are not so privileged. We have to allow them to grow up, and we sometimes may have to sacrifice our own interests so that our brothers can come up at same level. If we allow that kind of approach, and people should be aware of that, it should be the approach of all the sections of the country, we will realize that we can survive as a democracy, and this democracy is much needed in a society like India. We are seeing that India is surviving as a democracy, whereas those countries who had got decolonized at the same time were not able to sustain that democracy. We are very proud of our democracy. We have our own problems, but still I would like to believe, and I think most of us would believe, that India is a successful democracy, and I don't see any danger of its disintegration. India is a great democracy, one of the greatest democracies of the world, and we all should hope that India would survive as a democracy, and we all will respect the democratic order of the society, and plurality should be seen as something, as an asset for us. We will survive as a democracy and we will celebrate the plurality, different voices, different flowers, and this is called India. India is a great democracy, and with so many flowers blooming in this garden called India. Thank you.